Don Lewis, coming to you from the beautiful metaverse, and more particularly beautiful Danville, Illinois, and welcome to Midday with Reverend Don. And as you know, if you follow Midday with Reverend Don, you can type your comments or questions into whatever platform you may happen to be watching on, and they will show up here in my chat room and we can talk directly, which for me is certainly the most pleasurable part of this broadcast. You know, I've been doing broadcasting of different kinds for many years, and for a long time, that broadcasting was just me being a talking head with no real back and forth unless someone called in, which was not always possible and not always convenient. So for me, to be able to have this back and forth with you through the chat room is actually very refreshing. It's similar to the effect when we moved my Monday night chat room to a Zoom format. We could bring everyone on in video. It really revitalized the event after many years in a print format. But being able to see people and talk to them was wonderful. And here, even though I can't see you, being able to talk to you in real time greatly adds to the pleasure of the experience of having this conversation. And hello to Mary in the chat room. It's good to see you. And Mary says, I love your face. Thank you, Mary. That's very sweet. Mary's a lovely person. She helped me with the move. Hello to Janet in the chat room. Hello, Brian in the chat room. Hello, Renee in the chat room. And I've been quite enjoying this daily broadcast. Some days I'm a little more focused than others, but you know, you kind of have to expect that when it's every day. And I find that usually it's not one subject we talk about, but several. Hello to Anna in the chat room. Good to see you. Hello to Calvin from Temple of the Oak in North Carolina. Welcome, Calvin. So we talk about a lot of different things. Sometimes we talk about metaphysics. Sometimes we talk about just what's going on in my life or other people's lives. Sometimes we talk about new products that I'm working on or new projects I'm working on. We've talked about all kinds of things here, and also, of course, current events. I think today I want to talk a little bit about hello to Magical Mermaid in the chat room. Of course, I want to take a moment to talk about my Patreon. And if you don't know about my Patreon, you can learn about it at revdonlewis.com, and we do a lot of fun things through the Patreon. We have the weekly chat room I was talking about earlier. That chat room has been going over 30 years. It began on about.com. For many years, it was on witchschool.com. Now it's at revdonlewis.com through my Patreon. I do a monthly newsletter at Patreon. I do a monthly seminar at Patreon. This month's seminar is on oracular work and mediumship. We're going to talk about what that is and how you do it. You know, the pros and cons associated with it. It will be a pretty thorough discussion. I also offer a monthly surprise, which, of course, I'm not going to tell you what that is because then it wouldn't be a surprise. But all these things are available to my Patreons and even a monthly consultation at the highest level. This Saturday, I am offering a special event open to all my Patreons, an evening with the Corellian ancestors, which will be stories of the ancestors and also channeling from the ancestors. And it is open only to my patrons and invited guests. I have invited a few members of the High Corel family to join me. And it should be a nice evening. I originally thought about possibly opening it farther through tickets, but then I decided to just keep it to Patreon. But it's open to all the patrons. And Anna says, is it possible to do a recording of the Patreon events that are in the middle of the night in the UK, or are they too personal for a recording? Actually, I have been trying to record, certainly the seminars will be recorded. Some of them are recorded, but the weekly chat room I don't record, because that way people can speak freely and not worry about who else may see it. Hello to Renee in the chat room. It is 7 o'clock Central this Saturday evening. And so I do try to record what seems appropriate to record, and then the link is put on Patreon. So if you're at the seminar level and you didn't catch the seminar last month, you still can. It's still there. And that will be true this month as well. And hello to Deb in the chat room. Good to see you, Deb. And, you know, various other things show up on the Patreon. It all depends. And you know, I'm sure it will vary frequently because it's not offered by rote. But for example, the monthly newsletter includes artwork, mini spells, many of the things that used to be available in the virtual box at witchschool.com, which I don't think they're still doing, I'm not sure. But you can get them through my Patreon now if you were enjoying them. Many of those same features appear there. So these are things I'm doing. Of course, there's also CorellianPublishing.com. Our newest book is Travel Magic by Lisa McSherry, which will be out early in August. Our latest book, is the multilingual edition of The 5 Mystic Secrets, which is The 5 Mystic Secrets written by my late mother, Lavida. The first major exposition of Corellian thought, available now in 8 languages. Hello to Brenda in the chat room. We also have the Corellian degree lessons in both paperback and hardback. We have Ritual and Theory and Practice. And, you know, maybe I'll take a moment and talk about Ritual and Theory and Practice. You know, I always swore that I would never write a book of ritual scripts because I'm not actually fond of using ritual scripts, although you can't tell that from the Corellian illustration, but that's a special case. Because it touches on so many important teachings. But generally, I prefer ritual to be done from the heart and not from a script, unless it's necessary. I do understand sometimes it's necessary, particularly for people who are learning, for people who perhaps have memory issues, or who just feel put on the spot. So I get that. So I'm not saying it should never be done, but I prefer when you're able to do it straight from the heart. So I wasn't going to write a book of ritual scripts. And in fact, I have a policy that I try not to write a book unless I have something original to say on the subject. It's one reason I waited so long to write those first degree lessons. It was only when I realized how many things I had to say on the subject that no one else was saying that I finally agreed, yes, I should write this. And Ritual and Theory and Practice was the same. When I finally wrote it, I wanted to include understandings that I didn't think were general. One of them was the systemized approach I tend to take to ritual, which I think is helpful. I kind of feel that Ritual and Theory and Practice is not entirely unlike the Rider-Waite-Smith Tarot. And what do I mean by that, you say? You know, most people think the Rider-Waite-Smith Tarot is a very traditional tarot. It's nothing of the sort. It was absolutely revolutionary. What made it revolutionary is that they illustrated the pip cards, which had never been done previously to my knowledge. And what this did is it offered a visual ability to either intuit the meaning of the cards or to memorize the meaning of the cards, depending on how you chose to read them. But instead of just the numbers, you now had a picture and a story that went with that picture that could help you to internalize that meaning. In creating the way that Ritual and Theory and Practice approaches ritual, I tried to use that same idea, that there are stages in a ritual. And if you understand those stages, knowing what to do becomes far easier, even if you're just a beginner. A lot of people, almost all people follow these stages, but they don't think about it in that systematized way. And so I thought that was a good way to approach it. I also included many, many different ritual techniques. So although I did offer ritual scripts, it included many different acts of power for each ritual to give people as broad an understanding as I could. And hopefully they understand when they read that book that these are only examples, that they can apply everything they know, everything they learn to create new and different rituals that aren't following um, anyone else's script unless they wish to. Because the beauty of ritual is how it can be a personal expression, even when you're a group, and how you can bring your knowledge, your experience, your background to this. So I highly recommend Ritual in Theory and Practice, and you can find that at CorrellianPublishing.com. I also may at some point do another book on ritual, because for the Common Book of Witchcraft and Wicca, I did another series of rituals, which were originally created for Pagans Tonight Radio, and which added another dimension to ritual that I think is invaluable, particularly for online ritual, where the people taking part may come from all over the world. And that is, each of the Sabbat rituals in that ritual cycle observes both Sabbats that are taking place in both hemispheres, the Northern Hemisphere and the Southern Hemisphere. So when you're celebrating Beltane, and you're doing so internationally, you should also be celebrating Samhain, because some of the people taking part will be doing so. And what I found by taking this act on the radio, because we had an international audience, was that it really expanded my understanding of the Sabbats. And Brenda says, whenever I've done ritual, I've used notes, but everything is from the heart and spirit. This is what I always did. If you look at the videos of even the illustrations, it's largely what I've tried to do. But the illustrations, as I say, are a teaching tool as well as an expression of worship, and they are a restatement of Correllian teachings about the universe. So they're a little more codified, as are initiations, than normal ritual. But in normal ritual, I really prefer to just set everything aside and act from the heart. I usually would have an order of service to remind myself of everything I had planned to do. But as far as the actions, they were spontaneous and came from the heart. And I recommend doing this. Now, if you came from a ceremonial background, this would, for most people from that background, be anathema. They are great believers in repeating things exactly. It's even a teaching of many branches of ceremonialism. But that's not my background. My father came from that background. But my mother and I are Correllian. We came from a very different point of view. And Deb says, Lord Don, I'm here to help you if needed. Thank you, Deb. I will probably take you up on that. Deb helped me with re-editing the Common Book of Witchcraft and Wicca, which was a huge help. And actually, that is a very welcome offer, Deb. I will certainly take you up on it. I've been very fortunate to have people help me in the last year or so with these publications. Sir Ebony Nash helped me with Ritual in Theory and Practice, and other people have helped with other books. So hopefully we will continue this, and hopefully Deb and I will collaborate on a project here presently. Because, you know, when you put a book together, there's so much to do, and most people don't understand that. I was speaking with a friend who is a published author recently, and we were talking about how most people have a very false idea of what's involved in this. And Magical Mermaid says, isn't the process of making jack-o'-lanterns a form of ritual? And it certainly can be. But, you know, almost everything in life can be approached in a spiritual manner that treats it as a prayer or a ritual. Certainly everything important you can approach in that way. Certainly something like a jack-o'-lantern, if you think about it, it certainly can easily become a ritual. But I was talking with my friend, and I've been talking with several published authors lately. I'm trying to make sure that I'm thinking of the right conversation. But I believe this was with a friend who is both published by, although actually we may all have talked about this, but both published by companies and self-published as well. And we were talking about how self-publishing so often now is the way to go. And one of the things that came up is, you know, people watch shows like Murder, She Wrote, and think that if you publish through a publishing house, you're going to have all kinds of support. And they'll be sending you on speaking tours and setting up engagements for you. And um, you'll be solving murders in New York or things like this on the publisher's dime. This is not what happens. You are still the primary promoter of your work, even if you're working with a publishing house, unless you're very well known, at which point, at some point, that may shift. But until you get there, you still have to do the promotion yourself, which is one of the reasons that self-publishing can often be the way to go, because you're going to be doing most of the work anyway. And the hard part that having a publisher for in the past was really helpful for is now no longer hard. And that is the physical production of the book. Now, there are still things a publisher can be good for, like getting you in stores and things like that. But there are also ways to do that yourself too. So I actually am a great believer in the idea of self-publishing. Publishing on demand now makes this possible. And as technology continues to move forward, it's going to become more and more possible. In fact, I would go so far as to say that working with a professional publishing house doesn't really offer that much at this point. I'm not going to say it offers nothing. And it depends on the nature of your work and what you're able to do. But people do tend to have an incorrect idea of how this works. And I too have been published through a major publishing, well, a medium-sized publishing house, and I've done self-publishing. And I'd have to say I've done better with the self-publishing. So watch for more from CorellianPublishing.com, because more is coming. And hello to Jason in the chat room. And Mary says, "You are loved." And thank you, Mary. I appreciate that. I love you too. I love all of you. I love spending this time with you. And, I have to say, if anything, this year has caused me to focus on what I love and who I love more than previously. Because I'll tell you, I felt very much like my life was heavily about work previously. And I'm probably working harder now than I was then. But I do feel that I'm having a greater feeling of satisfaction. Part of that is, some people in life. Well, let's have a moment for an energy lesson in the middle of our broadcast. In life, we all run on energy. Everything in the universe is composed of energy, and we all are constantly exchanging energy. We generate energy and we put energy out, and we pick up on other people's energy and the energy of everything in life. This is why we're psychic. This is why why people can get a feeling without intentionally doing a reading. They're picking up on it. We always do. However, sometimes there's a strong imbalance in what one person is putting out and another person is taking in. And I'm sure we're all familiar with that term, psychic vampire. And some people, usually with no conscious intent, no intention of harming anyone, but simply because they're unwell, they will take in more than they're putting out. And this can become a serious problem. Particularly for people who like to pride themselves on being good people, because they don't want to deny the energy to someone who's unwell or who otherwise needs it, but it can leave a person very drained. So what do you do about this? Well, once you know, there are ways you can shield yourself, but sometimes just getting out of the situation makes a difference. And sometimes that's all that can make a difference. When we form connections to people, and we do, usually unconsciously, it creates a bond that exacerbates that sharing of energy. And sometimes when someone is taking too much, you have to break that bond to be able to stop it. I knew a lady many, many years ago, and I've spoken about her a couple of times, but I'm not going to mention her name because this is a less flattering example. But she was one of the psychics who worked with us at J&M Psychic Fairs. And she was a psychic vampire. She was also an older woman who was in poor health. Um, and so people didn't necessarily begrudge her the energy, but she took an awful lot. And some of the people did begrudge it. And the way they handled it varied. And some of them felt she was doing it quite deliberately, that she would connect to someone else and just suck their energy out. One of those people made it a point, because they knew this lady was diabetic, possibly why she was taking so much energy, and they just imagined the conduit she had opened to them, and started putting out the energy of sugar. And presently they said that conduit stopped. But other things you can do is you simply break the cord and seal it off so it can't reconnect. But when someone's consciously connecting to you, that's much harder to maintain because they'll reattach. And when you have a lot of energy, you don't always notice. When you work with a lot of people, you don't always notice. One of the things I found earlier this year is I had an awful lot of energetic connections that were sucking energy out of me that I needed to cut. And I'm sure I haven't cut all of them. But after so many years, and even with psychic shielding and even with psychic hygiene, there were an awful lot of energy suckers, for want of a better way to put it. And disconnecting those has made a big difference. And I'm still looking for them. And of course, in life, we all have. It's partly a natural phenomenon. And hello to Azidionis. Welcome, Azidionis. It's a natural process, but it's sometimes a conscious process. And you have to watch for those. But more often it's unconscious, which makes it more difficult. Because, again, if you're a spiritual person, you usually don't want to deny that person energy that they need if you have it and you can give it. But sometimes you overestimate what you can give. And I hope that I'm pronouncing Acidionis correctly. I believe I have pronounced it correctly before. I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly today. I pride myself on language, but I certainly don't always get pronunciations correctly. I found that particularly with Indian words, but I do my best. And language has been a frequent topic of conversation on this broadcast and on Magic TV when I was doing my vlog. And pronunciation, which I've somehow segued into, but pronunciation is one of those things people often worry about needlessly. Because in truth, there are usually several ways to pronounce something that are all correct enough. And when people try to say, no, the absolute correct way to pronounce it is, the question that you have to ask is, what makes that correct? In English, there are two standards that can be considered to be correct, only one of which is in common use today, and that's the so-called received pronunciation, also called RP English. And there is no American English equivalent in common use, which means there's also no objective standard for pronunciation. There was in the form of the transatlantic dialect. And I think it's making a bit of a comeback, but not enough to be said to be an objective standard at this time. California News dialect kind of replaced it, although I think that that has taken on a new name, but only kind of replaced it. So we have many different pronunciations based on the dialects that we're speaking. And being overly worried about them anyway, in my opinion, is rather pedantic. but it has been the source of some interesting conversations. And this is true in almost every language. One of the conversations we've had historically had to do with pronunciation of deity names. And in some cases, such as the deities of ancient Egypt, there is no one who can make an authoritative pronouncement on how these words were pronounced. Um, there are a couple of peoples who were there and wrote down Egyptian words as they understood them, um, which gives some objective, contemporary commentary. But some of these were not using alphabets, they were using syllabaries. And that does not necessarily allow for a direct transliteration. But the Greeks were using a modern alphabet. So when people say that the Greeks were debasing Egyptian pronunciation, I don't see any reason to think they were. They were sitting right there listening to them speak. They added Greek endings, but I think they must have been relatively close to the pronunciation being used at the time. But Egypt was an extremely long-lived culture. And those words and names went through variations over the course of millennia. And you see this in the hieroglyphics. You see letters that disappear out of names. You see others that show up that were not there previously because usage changed. So when people say, well, it was pronounced this way, there's also the question, well, when are you talking about? And when we talk about, for example, Greek deity names, the same question is actually there because the Greeks did not speak one language in antiquity. Certainly not in the classical era. There were several dialects. Which one are you talking about? Usually they're talking about the Attic dialect, but it was not a universal pronunciation. And some of those deity names ranged extensively in how they were pronounced in the different dialects. And then later, Koine Greek became standard over a much wider area and pronounced things differently again. And what does this tell us? It tells us we have to be very careful of pedantry, that, that there often is not a single objective standard that can be honestly applied over a wide area. You have to be careful of blanket statements. So going back to psychic vampires for a moment, how would we apply this knowledge? Well, despite all the things I'm saying, you can't really make blanket statements. These are examples. But there are always going to be things that are different. There are things I will not have experienced. There will be things I may have found an answer that works for me but would not work for you. You may have to experiment because blanket statements never really are one size fits all. And people hate to hear that. I have heard so many people in the metaphysical community over the years complain about the idea that one size does not fit all. But wanting one size to fit all is intellectual laziness. Magic and metaphysics are not a cookbook that has exact recipes. They're an art that has skills that you learn and apply. It's like painting. Yeah, there are certain things that are going to produce certain results. You mix certain pigments, you'll get certain colors. But you can sometimes replicate those colors in multiple ways. There are different tools you can use, and the way that you arrive at the pigments in those different tools are not necessarily the same. If you're doing black and white artwork, pigment doesn't matter much at all. It's not a one-size-fits-all thing, and neither is metaphysics. There are endless variations, and this is important to remember. And on that note, I see that we've come to the end of our half hour, so let us close with our prayer, as we always do. But first, let me thank you for being here. I love you all. I love spending this time with you. I look forward to spending this time with you again tomorrow. And now for our prayer. Divine Mother Goddess, Divine Father God, beloved ancestors, we thank you for your presence in our lives, and we know you are always with us. But sometimes we forget. And we ask you to remind us in gentle, positive ways that you are there, and to help us to remember that we are never truly alone and we are never without aid, but you are always with us. And knowing you are always with us, but from respect, we thank you for your presence, and may you be blessed now and always. And I thank you for your presence, and may you be blessed now and always. And we'll see you tomorrow.